Hello, friends, family, enemies, and strangers of all kinds. Welcome back to Extra Milestone, your weekly film anniversary podcast where we take a trip all the way to the past to discover the classic films that have made the cinematic landscape what it is today. I am your host, Sam Noland, and I am joined by one of my very good friends, one of my favorite guests to have on Extra Milestone, and someone who, if you don't know, you will love by the end of this episode. It is back on the show, Emily Kubincanek. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me, and you're really flattering me with this intro.
That's what I do. I only have on guests that I like, so let that say whatever it will, as I morph into Jeff Goldblum for what I'm sure will not be the first time over the course of this episode. Emily, it's good to be talking with you again. I'm excited to not remember lots of names with you again.
Oh my goodness. I hope we're better this time.
Yeah, last time was not good. That was not either of our finest hours when it came to recalling names off the top of our heads. And we got a lot to talk about today. So my fingers are crossed, my toes are crossed. I think it'll be a fun time.
Yes.
So with that in mind, we have a triple feature today. This is something that I try not to do often, but there are times that call for it. And this is one of them, because we have three radically different movies that span the cinematic art form in many ways, time-wise, genre-wise, even quality-wise, some would argue. And we're going to discuss all these things over the course of the episode. And we have decided, and this was not easy, listeners, you don't even know how hard this was, but we've decided we're going to be discussing these movies in chronological order. We felt that would be the best way to present those. And as such, the first film that we're going to be discussing is another silent film. This is the second one that we've done together. I remember last time you were saying that the silent era is an area that you're looking to explore a little more. So I thought, hey, I know what I'll do. Yeah. I'll have Emily back on to talk about Sergei Eisenstein's 1925 milestone, some might say extra milestone, classic, Battleship Potemkin. Now, Emily, I'd like to know right off the bat, this is the question I always ask of my guests, so why not do it again? I'd like to know, prior to seeing it, what was sort of your association with Battleship Potemkin? Have you heard of it? What kind of things did you know about it? Let me know, and the listeners.
I have definitely heard of it, and kind of the history around the fact that it was based on a real event and kind of the propaganda aspect of it, but I'd never watched it before, didn't really know much of how the style of it and everything, so this was very new to me for the most part.
Nice. And as I mentioned a second ago, the silent era is not, how would you describe it? Like, it's not your cup of tea, or just not something that you're quite as familiar with?
I'm really familiar with the history of it, and I think we mentioned this last time. I'm more familiar with the lives of the people who were involved than the actual movies. But I have been watching a few. I watched Lois Weber's Shoes since the last time we talked, which is just absolutely phenomenal. And a few others. So I'm doing my work.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah, Lois Weber is a fantastic director.
Yes.
I first learned of her through her short Suspense. I don't know if you've seen that one. That came out in like 1917, I think.
I think they just put it in the National Film Registry this year, honestly.
Oh, did they?
Mm-hmm. Along with Shrek.
Along with Shrek, yeah, of all things. That was all I heard about it. So I guess
My goodness.
I guess it makes sense. This is a weird year. Like, as if it wasn't already weird enough. F it, Shrek, National Film Registry. Listen, I'm not going to argue. It's a significant movie. It gets referenced a lot, but just weird. But yes, getting beyond that. And so you watched it several nights ago, if I remember correctly. And I'm curious, just to sort of clarify real fast. This is a thing we used to talk about on the show a lot. Not really as much of a thing anymore, but I feel it's significant. How did you get a hold of this movie? Did you watch it through a service or through a DVD or something? How'd you find it?
It was on Criterion Channel.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's where I watched it.
Nice, as did I. I saw that it's also available on Amazon Prime. That version is about 45 minutes longer, and I was like, what is this, like an uncut version of the movie? Turns out it just has a documentary about Sergei Eisenstein edited into it. So I'm like, okay, I'd be interested to see that. So if I had done my due diligence as a podcaster, then I would have seen that. But alas... time is finite. So I just watched the regular version. Not a long movie, about 75 minutes. And so having now had a few days to sort of reflect on it, what did you think? What did you feel? What was your reaction to Battleship Potemkin?
I really liked it. I wasn't sure... I don't know. I just didn't know what to expect, really, but it was really engaging and exciting, and the visuals were great. I think it warrants watching today for sure.
Yeah, today as in like in the modern era, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's the thing I was most sort of flabbergasted by is that, and we'll get into detail about this movie, but this is 95 years old, the movie is. The actual events that take place within it occurred in 1905. So that's like over a century now. And yet they feel just as prescient, kind of like to an eerie degree to a lot of the things that have been happening just this year, as a matter of fact. And it's something that I suppose had just never really occurred to me the first two times I saw it. I first saw this back in late 2015, if memory serves. I think it was on Netflix and it was expiring. Can you imagine that nowadays? Like a silent film on Netflix?
Oh, I know.
It's I think the oldest movie they have is like, I don't know, Gremlins or something. Like that's probably... I don't think it goes much further back than that. I kid, of course, because Netflix, I know you can take it, Netflix, but it's just so weird to think. They used to have a ton of silent movies on Netflix, and they just slowly got rid of them at all. Maybe back when I watched it was the beginning of the end, but I remember seeing it, and it was at a time when I think I had just signed up for Letterboxd, weirdly enough, the film review website, and so I was getting to explore a lot more of cinema that I knew even existed, and so I was excited to see it, and I really dug it that first time just because of I had never really seen anything like it. I wasn't that familiar with silent cinema. And then weirdly enough, an interesting thing happened the second time I watched it, which was a little under 2 years later. Matter of fact, I watched it the day I graduated high school. Because what better way to celebrate the graduation of high school than by watching this Russian propaganda film from the 1920s that was revolutionary in editing. That's always been my personality, is I don't like celebrating things in traditional ways. I like to just sort of act as though things are normal and sort of do something unexpected. And of course, we're in the holidays now, so the holidays are just not my jam, but that's just always kind of been my thing. And the second time I watched it was right after I had spent like almost the entire year up to that point, like 4 or 5 months, just taking in as much silent cinema as I possibly could. I went to like a silent film festival. I was watching them just on repeat throughout all day, every day. Matter of fact, that's when I saw The Gold Rush, which we talked about a little while ago. And I was like, I'm going to rewatch Battleship Potemkin with all this newfound knowledge and experience with the era that I have. And for whatever reason, that second time didn't hit me as hard. Couldn't tell you in a million years what it was. I just wasn't into it that time. I think my rating dropped like a whole 2 stars or something. It was really strange. And then I watched it again early this morning, and I'm like, oh, this is great. Like, it's really, really fantastic. I was just a moron that second time, as it turns out. This is really special. There's a reason it's so well acclaimed and so sort of iconic among film scholars and fans otherwise. So I want to get a little bit more into the legacy in a minute here, but first I want to talk generally a little bit about the movie. What are some things that you liked about Battleship Potemkin, Emily? What sort of stuck out to you as you were watching it?
I think the way that the characters act are very interesting to me. I really don't know very much about how accurate the events are compared to the movie, but I think just watching also the sheer number of people that are in this movie, especially towards the end, and like, I don't know, I'm just fascinated by the fact that this was all made in the way that it was. And I do think that definitely the editing is super interesting. But yeah, I don't know. And it is emotional to me, which propaganda inherently is, but in a way that I think regular movies are too. So really interesting.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with everything you said. And I happen to know a little bit about sort of the production of the movie and also the events that inspired it that might shed a little bit of light on that. So in regards to the historical accuracy, as it turns out, the first 2 acts of the movie, of which the movie is split into 5, and they're separated by intertitles. They each have a name, much in the way that some of Quentin Tarantino's movies, minus the nonlinear stuff. It's just sort of segmenting out the plot. The first 2 segments in which this rebellion occurs on a ship where the soldiers who are fighting for the Russian Navy are being just sort of grossly mistreated and by their superiors, stage a mutiny, stage a revolt that ends up going off. I don't want to say without a hitch, but they end up winning. Things end up going well. Evidently, everything after that is highly dramatized for the movie. Everything on the steps, the entire encounter late in the movie with the couple of warships. That's all made up. So, but the actual event, the mutiny, is sort of the basis that Sergei Eisenstein sort of expanded upon to make what is the movie we saw. What's most interesting about the production of that movie is that it was envisioned as sort of a grand cinematic sort of cherry on top, sort of star on top of the Christmas tree to what was this thing that was going on in 1925, which is sort of a lot of art, like in various different mediums. There were paintings and stage plays and songs and everything specifically about the Russian Revolution, the events in 1905 and subsequently after that. I don't know too much about all those things that happened in the wake of this. I really should have done more research, but the idea is that Battleship Potemkin was sort of meant to be this kind of grand magnum opus of this movement, this sort of smaller movement that was going on in the USSR at the time. And it was originally going to be this really huge epic with like 8 different stories of things that were going on at that time period. And it was June. And they said, all right, you have until December to finish the movie. And Sergei Eisenstein was like, I can't do that. And he's John Mulaney, apparently. I can't do that. I'm going to make it about one thing. And so he did. So what we essentially get, actually, is the budget, for all we know, and the storytelling zazz and passion for 8 stories all poured into one. And it really shows. I wonder what it would have looked like if those other 7 stories had been told. I'm sure they would have been separate movies and stuff, but it would have been really interesting to see even more like this. But what we got is really fascinating. And all the actors, at least as far as I know, the vast majority of the actors were non-professional. And they were utilized in a way that was sort of being revolutionized in Russia at the time, which is where they would allow editing, cinematic editing, to tell the story as opposed to, dialogue and plot and stuff. And so you'll see a lot of really quick shots in this movie, really quick takes where it's not necessarily the images, it's the juxtaposition of the images, and it's the visual metaphors all throughout this movie. And what we get as a result is a really just consistently engaging and kinetic story where there's not really a lead character. There are a few standouts, but really it's a way of harnessing the cinematic art form in a way that hadn't been used before to create an emotional response. And that was kind of the ethos going in, was this is going to be edited to be as emotionally resonant as possible. And it sounds like it was a success with both of us, right? Yeah.
I mean, I think I was expecting the one sailor to really be the main person throughout the whole movie, and then obviously something happens to him halfway through, and I was really surprised by using that, especially, I don't know, so long ago. It was very interesting to see that play out.
Yeah, this is before the production code, so there's a lot of things they wouldn't have been able to get away with, like even 10 years later. It was also in Russia, so they were under a different sort of leadership. I almost said dictatorship, just a little Freudian thing. They were under different auspices at the time when it came to what they could and couldn't show. So this can be a very graphic movie. A baby dies in this movie. It's so sad. It's a very famous shot of a baby carriage rolling down the steps, and we don't see it happen, but it's very, very heavily implied that this baby did not have a good day. So yeah, they hold nothing back when it comes to showing just how ruthless these events were, and how the powers at be can be, Yeah, to give a little background on kind of the plot of the movie, what happens is that it's, as you can probably tell by the title, the Battleship Potemkin, this Russian warship for the Navy, and the sailors on it, again, are being horribly mistreated. And it's one day they decide we just can't take it anymore. There are some belligerent officers that just are not being kind or respectful to them whatsoever. And then they're served these cuts of meat that are disgusting. Like it's like, remember in Rocky when Rocky's in the meat cellar and is punching those things for practice? Imagine those, but they're just out in the elements, unrefrigerated, uncovered in maggots. It's horrendous. They decide we can't do this. We refuse. And they're like, oh, is that insubordination I hear? Fine, we'll just execute you all. And as they're about to all be gunned down just on the ship as to be sort of made an example of, they appeal to the gunners' emotions and say, no, let's mutiny instead. And so they do. And what happens is that their actions ultimately inspire the people of Odessa, which is the city in the Ukraine, not the city in Texas. That confused the hell out of me when I first saw it 5 years ago. Odessa, Ukraine, inspire them to sort of rise up and revolt against the oppressive leadership. And of course, the leadership fights back. And because they're in power, they have more money and they have guns. And this is where I think kind of the modern analog that we're seeing comes in, where it's the oppressed people wanting equality, wanting freedom, wanting to escape from under the thumb of oppression. And because they just don't have the firepower, it ends up being a full-fledged fight. Is that kind of what you were picking up on too?
Yeah, I mean, they're obviously strong in numbers, but it's remarkable how people in power are still able to, go against that.
Yeah. This is not a new thing, and I love the way that it's sort of the suspense is sort of built, because what's happening is that the people of Odessa, just sort of the townsfolk, are all gathered on the steps, like to sort of show their support for the soldiers on the battleship and everything who are revolting and rebelling and stuff. And then suddenly it just dawns on them. You can almost hear the marching as essentially the fuzz shows up. Like, that's kind of the way I thought about it. And it's just this full-on massacre, and it's intensely effective. And then what happens, and I'm curious if you felt this way. This is probably my only problem with the movie, is those are the first 4 chapters kind of in a nutshell. Then the 5th chapter has the battleship Potemkin of the rebels. They go out to sea. They're about to be sieged by more loyal warships who have been sent by the powers that be and everything. And then at the last second, they decide, nah, we're going to be friends. That rang just a little false to me. That seemed like a little bit too much of a happy ending, and I could kind of tell that was made up. Did you feel the same way about that ending?
It definitely makes sense to me that that's probably fictionalized. And I am curious to see or to read on like what actually happened. But watching it, I don't know. I'm used to the happy endings on older films, so I just kind of accepted it, I think. But I get why you'd have a qualm with it.
Yeah, I think if memory serves, what actually ended up happening is that the Potemkin was retaken by the Russians, and they gave it a new name and sort of reclaimed it. And that was just kind of it. Like, there was no big display of power, at least not in the way that it's dramatized. But yeah, it's definitely a movie with an agenda. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah. Although I love the ending imagery of them waving to each other on both ships, honestly.
Just this little showing of solidarity. Like, it's not a bad ending. I just felt it was not quite in keeping with what had been built up so far. It's a very downtrodden movie for pretty much all of the first 4 acts. Like, there's that brief moment, like right before the massacre on the steps, where things seem like they're going well on the home front and everything. It just felt a little out of place to me, but it was certainly a very effective movie. I found out something very interesting, and I did not know this when we decided that we were going to be talking about this movie. Emily, you're not going to believe me when I tell you this, but you may remember on the last Extra Milestone we did together, we talked about the Gold Rush and Sunset Boulevard, right? Guess which 2 directors both claim Battleship Potemkin is their favorite movie?
Charlie Chaplin and Mr. Weiler.
Exactly.
Wow.
I could not believe it. Like, it's just 1 in a million, what are the chances? The astronomical odds that the exact 2 directors that we talked about last time, their favorite movie would be our next subject of discussion. So I just thought that was very poetic and serendipitous. So I thought you'd like to know. What are some other things that sort of stuck out to you or affected you about Battleship Potemkin? Like, do you think it was pretty much covered, or are there other things that we've yet to unearth?
I guess the other things that I would say, are, I don't know. I think watching silent movies, especially this one that does such an interesting way of showing emotions through images, it's so impressive to me that when filmmakers of these early years are able to do things with no sound and very little, special effects, and they're able to make such an emotional impact on you. And for the most part, I mean, those are more impressive to me than any CGI or whatever kind of special effects and stuff. And so watching this, it's just, and especially the stuff in Odessa, is just so remarkable to watch them kind of construct the story through, like you said, not necessarily just what they show, but what they don't show. And I always love the thrilling and suspense that happens when they leave images out that would be gruesome, because your mind makes up such a horrible image on its own. So, yeah.
You could almost say that you can draw the line directly to the Blair Witch Project from that. Am I understanding that correctly, Emily Kubincanek?
You could assume that, yes.
Oh my. It's so funny that you mention sort of the contrast, I should say, with kind of the CGI bells and whistles that they have today. I was trying to think, because I'm thinking of other movies from right before this that I've seen. The one that comes to mind first is Greed from 1924, it only just occurred to me in this second, directed by Erich von Stroheim from Sunset Boulevard. I did not do that on purpose, but the connections are just running rampant in this episode. But that's a movie that's an epic movie of just sort of the rise and fall of a couple as greed sort of overtakes them. Go figure. It's a movie called Greed. That movie is very conventionally edited, I would say. The power of that one is more in the imagery than anything, but just when it comes to actually the way that the scenes are cut together, it's very standard, at least from what I remember. It's been a couple of years. I'm trying to think, if I'm an audience seeing this movie in 1925 or later in other nations, is this the 1925 equivalent of something like Avatar now, where it's so, I know that sounds silly, but is it kind of the same thing where this is nothing we've ever seen before? We didn't realize that this could be done. Of course, it helps that the movie is also fantastic and really emotionally resonant and powerful, but I would be fascinated to talk to someone who saw it at the time. Of course, there's no one alive today who can remember this, most likely. But even still, I wonder, because the movie was universally acclaimed when it came out. It was heavily censored, but the people who did get to see it were like, "Oh, this is remarkably powerful," and they were right to think so, and they're still they're still correct today. Do you have any kind of thought on that, about just what this would have been like to have not seen anything like this before?
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I hadn't thought about it that way. And I'm sure there were people like me who would gripe and say, "Oh, I like what they did before, and it's way more impressive than this garbage." But it is definitely, I mean, I'm sure it would be as jarring as the train movie that people were terrified of when
the Great Train Robbery.
But it's really interesting to think about it that way.
Yeah, because I'm trying to I was thinking that the kind of editing that's in this movie, and I know I'm really kind of going on about that aspect of it, but it really is the most significant element of it.
Mm-hmm.
You can draw the line directly from that to a lot of, the big exciting action blockbuster, or sometimes even just intimate dramas that we see today, and the way that it cuts back and forth between multiple things happening at the same time, the way it sort of distorts time and alters it by juxtaposing certain scenes with other scenes and things like that. This really, and actually last night I just so happened to watch Sergei Eisenstein's first movie, which came out earlier in 1925. That one was called Strike, and it was about a very similar thing, except it was at like a production plant, like a factory, and a result took place. So he certainly had an ethos, a subject matter that he liked to explore, and the editing in that movie is just as dynamic. So he had it right off the bat, and you can tell that it was very experimental at the time, and I guess it just hit a nerve right off the bat and never fizzled out, and never should, because this is kind of pure cinema right here. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, and I also think like similar to like the Czechoslovakian new wave that happened when the communist government funded a lot of films, the stories that they chose to tell in this way with the filmmakers that they end up doing is just really fascinating, because you wonder, I don't know, like how would this story be told in the hands of someone else who didn't have that hand on editing, or didn't have a vision of imagery in the way that he does. So yeah, I would love to just kind of compare the subject matter that they choose to do, because a lot of the Czech movies are about World War II and things like that, but heavily kind of, I don't want to say censored because they weren't, but, maybe, but just kind of skewed, I guess.
Yeah, and a lot of them were sort of insidiously commenting on like the incompetence of those in power. So that's a very fascinating comparison you draw there. Matter of fact, by sheer coincidence, I just watched The Fireman's Ball a few weeks ago. That's kind of like that's a early film by Milos Forman, who directed One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, recent Extra Milestone, and Amadeus, a future Extra Milestone. Mark my words there, among many others. And yeah, that's certainly a very, like, they're certainly of a piece. They just have a different sort of, I guess I'll say, genre about it. Yeah, there's definitely, I'm sure there are dozens of movies from this time period about similar things that have just completely faded into obscurity. And I'm not even talking about the ones that have been lost to history forever, which a lot of silent movies have. I bet there are some that still exist out there that are just really unremarkable. But we're lucky because Battleship Potemkin is quite remarkable, wouldn't you say?
Yes, definitely.
And it reminded me of another movie from the silent era, from Russia, as a matter of fact. So from the same nation, that's also a bit of a milestone in editing. And it got me to thinking, would this be a good introduction to the silent era? Battleship Potemkin, I mean. I think I saw it relatively early in my silent era education as well. Would you show this to someone first? Do you think this would get them jazzed enough to want to explore further into the art form?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think it really depends on the person. I think people who are into action sequences of today's cinema, I think this would be a very interesting thing to start them on. I definitely think that it's a movie that is kind of essential to watch when you are visiting silent film, along with, the other classic things. But yeah, that is, I think it could get people jazzed. I think it could also maybe lose people without I don't know, a lot of plot and kind of the conventional storytelling things in Hollywood silent movies.
I think you make an excellent point. I think this would potentially be a good one, but I think it would also be important to let them know, if you're trying to inform someone on the era, that not all of them are like this. Like, let's be clear. But also, I think you're right when you say that it is clear to see the connection between this and a lot of the movies we see now, almost a century later. So I think it would certainly not be, and I use this word in air quotes, mark my words, it would not be boring in the way that a lot of people maybe assume that silent cinema is, you know?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so I would say probably start with a comedy, because those are just, it's impossible to go wrong there. I think this would be a great introduction to dramatic silent cinema, which is arguably even richer. But again, I say arguably, so who knows? Here's a movie not to start with when it comes to the silent era, and this is the one I was talking about earlier, which this reminded me of very starkly. It is a movie called Man with a Movie Camera. It is an abstract documentary directed by Giga Vertov, who is known kind of only for this movie. Like, he did some other work around the same time period, but it's really this one that is the reason his name is still remembered today. And it is almost not even really a movie. What it is I think it's just a little over an hour of just footage shot in these 4 Russian villages in the late 1920s, edited together in a really interesting way. No plot, no through line, no characters even, although there are people, of course. It's just life. And it's just kind of 60 minutes of like almost pure cinema, because that's the way that cinema kind of started. If you see a lot of the really early silent films, like from the 19th century, they're just sort of filming stuff happen. There's the famous one of the train arriving at the station and the workers leaving the factory. There's not much of a narrative there, besides they just thought it would be interesting to shoot that. You know what I'm saying? This is very much kind of a similar thing, but what it does is it does that, but like a bunch of times. It's like Battleship Potemkin, like turned up to 11, just with a dash of cocaine or whatever drug was going around at the time. It's really inaccessible if you're unfamiliar with the era, but I think once you're sort of acquainted with it, then it's a great place to go to just see kind of the essence of the silent era just sort of play out before your eyes. I think it's really hypnotizing, and it's one of my favorite movies, frankly, just because of how kind of essential it is and how pure it is, essentially. But yeah, I think we've talked about a lot of really interesting things. So unless there's anything else that you had to say about Battleship Potemkin, what do you say we move on to our second feature?
I'm ready for the second one. For sure.
I'm really glad to talk about this one. I think this is the only one that we'd both seen beforehand, correct?
Yes.
That's very good. And I'm so excited to talk about it because it is from the year 1950, a movie that isn't talked about a ton nowadays. Like, it's not one of the most popular 1950 movies to kind of a casual cinema fan, but I think it really should be. This is another one of my favorite movies. It is Henry Koster's Harvey.
We predict you'll greet Harvey with laughter and rousing applause. How do we know? Because for 5 long years, audiences did just that on Broadway for the most talked about Pulitzer Prize-winning comedy of our time. And now at last, Harvey comes to the screen, better, richer, funnier than it ever was on the stage. Starring James Stewart as Elwood P. Dowd, America's most amiable citizen, with hilarious Josephine Hull and a grand cast. And once again, the critics are raving. Says Luella Parsons, and Walter Winchell. Hedda Hopper.
So, Emily, I'll ask the same question that I did before. What's your story with Harvey, the 6 foot, 3.5 inch rabbit?
I remember watching this years ago. I am a huge Jimmy Stewart fan. He is a fellow Pennsylvanian. He's just unlike anyone else. And so I was going through all of his movies, I think, and watched this and just couldn't believe that it was a story. I was just like, this is just unlike anything I've ever heard. And so I hadn't watched it since then. I actually, I went to the Jimmy Stewart Museum that's in Indiana, Pennsylvania, and they have the rabbit that was in the stage production there on
really?
It's just sitting on like a set chair that was for Jimmy Stewart. No protection around it or anything. Like, they really trust people, which is very Jimmy Stewart.
There's probably someone in the costume who, if anyone tries to take it, hey.
Maybe, I don't know. He didn't say anything when I took a picture next to him, but
keeping a watchful eye.
But after that, and then I didn't end up rewatching it just because life's crazy. But so I was really excited to revisit it for this.
Nice. Yeah, this is one I've actually seen a handful of times, and I recall, I think the first I ever heard about it was actually twofold, and the first one is really weird. It's on the TV show Whose Line Is It Anyway? I don't know if you're familiar.
Yes.
There was this random throwaway gag that Greg Proops made one time where they were playing a game called Multiple Personalities, which is just one of the funniest games. And they only played it like a half dozen times, which is a goddamn shame. But they would have 3 actors on the stage. It's an improv comedy TV show, if you don't know. They would have 3 actors on the stage, and they'd each be holding a prop, and it would be completely random. They'd have like binoculars, a map, a telescope, something like that. But the secret is each prop corresponds to a different personality, and these would be in the form of celebrities that they'd have to impersonate. And the actors on that show have a varied skill level when it comes to impressions. It's always been my dream to play that game someday, but alas, I know that day may never come. But there was one time where I think it was Jimmy Stewart, Braveheart, and Liberace. I remember that so specifically. Those were the 3, and Greg Proops had the Jimmy Stewart prop and just randomly said, oh look over there, it's my friend Harvey. And I was like, what is that? That's got to be a reference to something. So I looked it up. Turns out it's this movie Harvey. And then I don't think I heard about it again for a few years until, and listeners, if you listened to the show for any length of time, you knew I was going to bring this up. I discovered this list, Empire Magazine's top 500 movies of all time. And at number 129 was this movie Harvey. I was like, oh yeah, that's the Whose Line Is It Anyway thing. You know what? I read the description. Sounds wacky enough. I'll give it a watch. Turns out it's a very sincere and melancholy kind of a character piece, while also being perfectly functional as a comedy. I think that's probably my favorite thing about it, is that it is equally effective at both. Like, there's not one aspect, like not one genre leaning in this that ever overpowers the other. I think that's really impressive about the movie. Do you concur with that?
Oh yeah. I mean, as I was rewatching it, I was just thinking about, it's just remarkable to me the way that they're able to make this funny, but also not entirely demeaning to someone who would be this way in real life. And I truly think it's because of who Jimmy Stewart is and like the kind of person that he can be on screen. Because I just can't imagine anyone else. I know they remade this, and I will never watch another version of it because I just can't.
You know, it's funny. I was going to rewatch it a few years ago. I was doing this podcast with my friends, Anthony and Jason, and we were doing an episode about the best and worst remakes ever. And I was looking up random ones that I haven't seen. And that was on my list. And I simply just ran out of time before recording the episode. So in another life, I would have watched that one instead of something else. I've never gotten to it. And honestly, outside of that very specific context of doing a podcast about remakes, I don't really have any interest. This was adapted from the play, the stage play, by Mary Chase. Several of the actors in the movie performed in that play, as a matter of fact. So they know these characters very well. Jimmy Stewart played this character on stage for 6 months, I think, somewhere in the ballpark of that. On the Blu-ray I have, there's a little audio introduction by Jimmy Stewart that he did in like the early 90s, I think. So lots of retrospect. Yeah, it's really adorable. Like, this is one of my favorite pictures that I ever did. And I wish Will Ashton were here just for a little while so we could do Jimmy Stewart impressions together. Will, if you're listening, you know what to do. But let's move on. So, and something very interesting that he said in this introduction was that the hardest character, or the most impressive character to pull off, I should say, is Josephine Hull, who plays Vida, Elwood's sister. Elwood is James Stewart, and she actually won an Oscar for her performance in this, and rightfully so, I think. And the way that Jimmy Stewart sort of articulated it was that because she's his sister, and I suppose we should give a little rundown of the plot, just in case, because this might sound very strange if people don't know. You know, Emily, I'm curious, if you had to sort of summarize this movie just in a couple of sentences, what would you say? How would you describe it to someone?
Oh my goodness, I'm always very bad at this. I'd say it is about a very well-meaning man who has an imaginary friend, air quotes, named Harvey, who is a giant rabbit. And his family and those around him try to make sense of it, but it just becomes a bumbling mess of a time. And in the end, they all kind of learn to appreciate who he is and the fact that he can see a 6-foot rabbit that's not there, supposedly.
Yes, supposedly. There is some evidence to the contrary, which I find very fascinating. But yeah, I think you just put it together perfectly. If we were in an elevator together, I would have just gotten off on my floor wanting to see this movie. So
right.
Very nicely done. Yeah, and the thing that's always struck me about this movie is that you were mentioning earlier about how the movie doesn't portray Elwood P. Dowd, James Stewart's character, in any kind of demeaning light. And I think it's quite the opposite, actually. I think what we slowly find out over the course of the movie, but not even slowly, actually, come to think of it, it's apparent kind of right from the jump, is that Elwood P. Dowd might be the least crazy of them all.
Yeah, and he's definitely the one who's the happiest person, I think, out of everyone.
Exactly. And we see immediately that his entire family, of which we've got his sister Vida, Josephine Hull's character, we've got her daughter Myrtle, played by the actress whose name I forget, so take a drink, it's already happened. Look up the actress. Victoria Horn plays Jimmy Stewart's niece and Josephine Hull's daughter. They're kind of the principal cast, and they are flagrantly intolerant of any of Elwood's, in air quotes, nonsense from the very beginning, to the point where they're trying to get in big with the high society, essentially. And it's kind of a weird plot point to modernize, but they're essentially trying to marry off Myrtle to like a rich man is basically the gist I get, is that they're trying a la Portrait of a Lady on Fire minus the portrait. They're just trying to impress, some well-earning man who will bring pride to the family. And their mother has passed away recently, and I get the sense that they're kind of living off the inheritance of that. They have this big mansion that they live in, and every time some high society guests come over, they make a point of getting Elwood the hell out of the house. And he likes to spend a lot of time at Charlie's, which is a bar, a tavern, some call it. And we see right off the bat that Elwood's a very heavy drinker, is never more than 10 minutes away from a martini, it seems, and has this sort of this happy drunk, in air quotes, way of carrying himself. And I think that certainly kind of informs the character. But again, as you were mentioning, he's also kind of the most the nicest of them all. Certainly, it's Jimmy Stewart. It would be hard not to be. Every single person he meets, he just makes them feel like they're the only person in the world. And he's got this is always my favorite quirk of the character. He's got a stack of business cards in his pocket that are not for a business. They're just for Elwood as a man. Oh, you really should take one of my cards. And now if you want to get a hold of me, call me at this number and not that one. That's the old number right there. Does that to literally everyone he meets. And the funniest part to me is that he also invites everyone to dinner. Like they're going to have a dinner party in a couple of nights. I really want to see that dinner party. I hope everyone goes. Like I would love to see just even a deleted scene about that. That would be really funny. But yeah, he's kind of the most free of pretense of them all. Just has no agenda, has no face that he needs to put on for them, isn't out to get anything from anyone. And what we see over the course of the movie is how infectious and how therapeutic that can be, and also how hard it is to be that person. And that's where the real poetry of this movie comes through, wouldn't you say?
And I think how hard it is for people to believe that someone can just be that way.
It's almost like they're suspicious in some way. Like they're trying to suss out some ulterior motive. Like, what are you playing at here? Like, I think something very interesting is that throughout kind of the first half or so of this movie, there are a lot of instances in which how should I say this? In which Elwood P. Dowd's sort of strange personality trait is kind of humorously obscured from the characters he meets. Like they're always interrupting them just as he's trying to introduce Harvey before they can realize that he has this notion of a giant 6 foot 3.5 inch rabbit, and I will specify the height every time. So don't think I won't do that. But it's clearly a movie about I would say empathy, but I feel like that's maybe a little too simplistic, about sort of meeting someone on their own terms and sort of accepting who they are, even if there's someone who you disagree with or that's kind of opposed to you. And I think that's certainly something that Elwood P. Dowd preaches as well as practices. And it's really quite inspirational, actually, at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And one thing that I did get to thinking about, though, as I was rewatching this, and it never occurred to me, is Elwood, and I think it's kind of refuted at the end of the movie, but regardless, is Elwood too nice? Is there a line that can be crossed between common courtesy and stuff and getting walked all over, essentially? Like, is there a time when you should stand up for yourself. And I think the conclusion of the movie would say, in this circumstance, no. But I'm curious if that occurred to you as you were watching this.
Yeah, I never thought about that. I mean, I guess he does a little bit in when they talk about if he's a drunk or not. And he doesn't really admit to it, and he just says, I enjoy a drink. And they're like, oh, like every day? And he's like, well, yeah. But like, he doesn't admit to it or really let them categorize him as that way. But I don't know. I mean, like, I can't imagine him being any different. And I kind of like that maybe that's not a subject of the movie, because it would be really hard to balance the two of like making a point and then also making that point, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of complexities in this movie that just sort of reveal themselves to me with every single time I rewatch it. And that's kind of what I was getting at a little bit. I think another way to describe it is that there's a way to read this that he's doing it for his own survival, essentially. It's a way of saying, like, listen, this is a cruel world, and for people like me who are just a little different than most, like, that's all there really is to it. I'm just a little different than a lot of other people, and just by the sheer nature of that, of having something that a lot of others might misunderstand upon first glance at the very least, that it would behoove me to be as nice as possible in every other context to kind of make up for that. You know what I'm saying? Like, there are only a couple of characters in the beginning of this movie, I should say, who accept Elwood P. Dowd for who he is. Among them, Charlie, the bartender, or I assume his name is Charlie. I might be wrong there, but the bartender is in on this, so to speak, and has no issue with it, and is like, "Oh, yep, let's another drink, and is another $3 for me. Why not?" You get the sense that it's kind of a pragmatic thing, but there's also a what's the word, a kinship in that bar that you can tell Elwood P. Dowd feels. It's kind of like the modern lingo I've heard to describe this kind of thing is finding your tribe, finding the place where you fit in most, with people who understand you and everything, and that being kind of a safe haven, a sanctuary to be who you truly are. And I think that's a really fascinating thing. And the fact that most of the movie takes place in like a mental institution of all places is really telling of the way that they have to kind of be, most of the characters, I should say, have to be kind of forcibly convinced, and not for undue reason, but they have to be convinced to see the good in this situation,
That was one thing that I realized this time watching it, was a lot of movies that are adapted from stage plays, you can kind of tell because they're pretty central in singular settings inside, or stay in one place for a very long time. But this one did not feel like it to me at all. I think it does a really good job of kind of expanding the locations a little bit.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That's a very interesting thing to take notice of, because a lot of plays have just a very finite number of locations. I'm not aware of how much this was altered from the stage version. It's my understanding that the spirit is there, but I'd be curious to know if there were like any incidental locations or scenes and stuff that were added for the purposes of the movie. So I would be fascinated to find that out. This is a play that's still in production to this day. Like, there have been tons of productions of it. Matter of fact, there was one at here where I live in Denver, in the theater scene, a few years ago. I can't remember exactly when, but it was when I was in high school and went down to the theater district, essentially, which is just a couple of buildings downtown. and saw posters for a production of Harvey. So it's still out there somewhere. It's kind of like the Elephant Man. It never goes away. Someone's always doing it because it's a really juicy role. You got to think that this is a lot of the roles in this movie, matter of fact, are so rich and so layered with, just multiple sort of ways of approaching the character that it would be any actor's dream. And indeed, a lot of them do make the best of it. And on that note, I want to get back to Josephine Hull, who I sort of got sidetracked from earlier. The thing that Jimmy Stewart was talking about in that audio introduction on the Blu-ray I have was that her role is kind of the hardest to pull off because she has kind of that balance all the way throughout of understanding that, yes, this is my brother, and thinking that like he needs to get help and stuff, and that we're not going to get anywhere from outright rejection, but also this is throwing a wrench into our plans, my daughter's plans and I, to just go about our way in the world, and we've got to figure something out. We've got to come to a conclusion. You very much get the sense that this is just kind of the culmination of a lot of things that are taking place off screen. Like, obviously this has been going on for years, and this is kind of when it all comes to a head, is the sense I get, where lots of characters get involved and everything. Because Josephine Hull has gotten in contact with the local law enforcement who are in charge of keeping Elwood away from the house while they have guests over. And one of the funniest things that happens in this movie is they have like their agent, their man on the street that they're going to send out. It's like, all right, go out there and take care of it. And this guy walks out into the hallway, slips on like a bar of soap, and takes one of the worst falls I've ever seen. Like, it's a insane tumble, and slides directly to the door of like the clinic. And a nurse opens up the door and is like, oh, the doctor will be right with you. So I always thought that was a hilarious joke. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of history, a lot of rich history to these characters, and I imagine their kinship in the stage version really informed that a lot.
I definitely think Vita's the funniest character, the whole time, and so being able to pull that off and never getting, I wouldn't say she's annoying ever, just kind of crazy in her own way, but constantly just high. She's pretty high energy the whole movie too. Seeing that pulled off, I'm sure, is not an easy performance to do.
I think the kind of the key to her character is that she is being thrust into a situation against her own volition, against her will, that she has no idea how to take care of. Like, who do you talk to for a problem like this? I mean, it seems relatively obvious to us now that we just sort of, meet them on their terms and maybe seek out psychological help or something like that. But you can tell this is a time when that was probably just not as much of a thing, or not like a go-to solution or anything. So she's trying to take care of it the only way she thinks she can. And of course, it leads to a lot of hijinks along the way. And this movie just never loses pace, which is really awesome. And eventually they all come to this really kind of divine enlightenment at the end, and this movie just puts a smile on my face. Like I'd be curious to hear if anyone has ever seen this movie and just not been put in a better mood because of it.
Yeah, I don't want to meet those people because I can't imagine.
Oh my! I think. Do you think that Josephine Hull is like the MVP of this movie, or is there? Like, how do you even choose? Do you have a thought on
that? I mean, I don't know, because I know that her role is probably something that's very hard to pull off, but also Harvey's a really hard, or not Harvey.
I was going to say Harvey appearing in this movie as himself.
Yeah, that's great at the end. Yeah. But Jimmy Stewart, I'm sure, I don't know. I think that's a hard character to pull off too. So it's between the two of them for sure.
Honestly, I think, and if we're expanding beyond the scope of just the performers, I really think that Mary Chase is the MVP to sort of construct this story, exploring this facet of society. The idea of something that, and I know there's like an actual term for it, but the one that I kind of like to use myself is mental classism. Like it's classism, but not in an economic sense. Like they're both like Elwood and Vita are very well off. Again, they live in this big mansion, so it's nothing to do with being impoverished or unfortunate in any way. It's just all about the different way that people see the world, the different ways that people see the world, I should say. And to make a movie about that is one like totally powerful, like it totally hits, it totally comes across while also not being depressing is really impressive. It's just heightened enough that we recognize that like this is a bit of a fanciful kind of fantastical situation, and indeed a lot of the characters, a lot of the events that take place are very stagey. You know what I'm saying? Like you can tell they were written and rehearsed kind of ad nauseum, and I don't want to say it doesn't come across, but it doesn't come across in a bad way, I should say. And yet to have that be just as powerful as just, you know, a straightforward story about this kind of thing, I think is the most impressive thing of all. And that it's just so much fun to watch and has so many funny bits and so many emotionally genuine bits is what really unlocks my heart when it comes to this movie.
Mm-hmm. I think, I don't know, it's always really impressive to me when writers are able to consider a concept that to anyone is insane. But a lot of the best stories and movies come out of that, of just kind of allowing yourself to go beyond the traditional stories that you want to tell, or finding a way to be different in telling, you know, the themes that you're talking about. I don't know. It feels really vulnerable to be able to do that. And so seeing it so well done in this, I'm like always very impressed.
Yeah, I think the vulnerability is really the key to this movie, because what happens over the course of it is that you see everyone starting to let their guard down. Most notably, and I always die laughing when this happens, at the mental ward, they have kind of the warden of the place. And what happens is that towards the end of the movie, the warden ends up becoming Elwood's patient, like lays down on the little couch and is just telling all of his problems to Elwood. Like, I'm just so unsure of myself, and do I have the ability to really run this place and everything? And he kind of gets more humiliated than anyone. And Elwood's just like, oh, well, why don't you tell me about how you're feeling and that kind of thing. And I always just really die laughing. But I think more than anything, what we find out is that there's this one scene which takes place in an alley behind the bar that has always been my favorite scene in the movie, where Elwood just kind of just pours his heart out and tells the entire story of like, well, now I always wanted a friend, and I wanted to be that friend to others. I wanted to be this source of positivity, and I figure if I can do that, then I've led a life worth living. And what we realize, a couple of things in that scene, is A, kind of the entire deal with his character, and B, that from the description of this movie, you would think, as you mentioned early in this conversation, that Elwood is probably going to be like the subject of the humor in this. And what we realize is, no, the joke isn't on Elwood. He's telling the joke, you know? It's really remarkable.
Yeah, the monologue in that scene is just really great.
Yeah, and one thing, and this is kind of random, but I just remembered it. There's a scene where where Elwood has a painting made of him and Harvey, and Harvey is invisible, of course, in the movie. But in this one painting, we see a painting of the giant rabbit and Elwood. I want to know who made that painting.
Yeah, and how?
Like, did Elwood just describe what Harvey looked like, or did they also have Harvey vision, essentially, like whatever you want to call it? So that's always been a funny little detail for me. It makes for a really humorous scene with Vida.
Yeah, that's great.
And then one other thing is that there's this scene towards the end where they're in the mental institution, and Elwood has decided to make a little bit of a compromise. I won't give away too much, but has just decided, like, well, if that's what everyone wants, then I'm willing to go along with that. And it reminded me of this impression that Jim Carrey did of Jimmy Stewart. That was kind of the purest distillation and I'm not going to do Jim Carrey's bit, but just look up Jim Carrey, Jimmy Stewart. It's the perfect summarization of everything that Jimmy Stewart is and was. The face, the pinnacle of wholesomeness. And I think Jim Carrey really nailed it. And this might be my favorite of Jimmy Stewart's performances. And he was well into his career. He had already been established as like one of the great actors, like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, The Shop Around the Corner. What are some of your other favorites of that era?
The Philadelphia Story, obviously.
Yes. Little sneak peek. Listen to Extra Milestone in a few weeks if you want to hear a little more about the Philadelphia Story.
I'm trying to think of other ones. I mean, yeah, those are the ones that I think of the most. But there's a lot. I mean, I appreciate the very small ones. He did one with Carol Lombard, which I love. I think it's called Made for Each Other, which she is such a comedic queen. And so I was so happy to see them together at least once. But yeah.
And of course, It's a Wonderful Life. How can we forget?
Yes, obviously.
But honestly, I feel like this might be the best Jimmy Stewart role that kind of really gets to the heart of it. And it's really some of the most perfect casting in movie history, I think. And
yeah,
it all amounts to what is just one of really my favorite movies. And I always just love when I get to watch it again. And I'm glad that I got to for this episode. So is there anything else that we haven't really gotten to yet that you wanted to bring up?
I guess just the fact that I love how this movie kind of states and shows like everything ends up the way that it should. You know, Myrtle ends up meeting someone who works at the mental institution, like someone way different than what they're aiming to marry her off to, which is just wonderful. And then like one of the doctors and the nurse end up realizing that they should be together. And so I don't know, it's just really remarkable to see his effect on people, and it really makes you realize, I don't know, the things that you can do for other people. And yeah.
Elwood, I want to see it emblazoned in brass. Elwood P. Dowd, ultimate wingman, really plays a lot of matchmaker in this movie. That's very impressive to me. And yeah, all I need is my friend Harvey here, and I'm happy with that. I think that's a wonderful note to leave the movie on. And I love the ending so much, and I love how it doesn't. There are a number of places that this story could have gone. I'm glad that it went to the one it did. So I'll just say that. And so I think if that's everything about Harvey, then we can move on to our third and final feature of the evening or morning or afternoon or whenever. What do you say?
I'm good with that.
I'm very eccentric today. And there's a reason for that. And that is because we are talking about a movie that neither of us had seen until just the past couple of days, which is fascinating. It's not often that this happens on Extra Milestone, so I'm excited to get to discuss it. It is Jonathan Lynn's 1985 dark comedy, Clue.
Every person in this room has the perfect motive.
Stand back!
For murder.
What do you mean? Murder.
But only one of these suspects is the murderer. Is it the timid Mr. Green?
Why are you screaming? Because I'm frightened of what? Screaming!
Or the militant Colonel Mustard?
If I was the killer, I would kill you next.
Huh?
I said if.
Mrs. White, who helped her husband on his way?
Well, it's a matter of life after death. Now that he's dead, I have a life.
Miss Scarlet, who's helped many men along the way?
Practice makes perfect. Huh.
Professor Plum, who's looking for a way?
I'm looking.
Mrs. Peacock?
I have absolutely no idea what we're doing here, but I am determined to enjoy myself.
Or did the butler do it?
No.
Paramount Pictures invites you to an evening of mystery.
Let us out!
Murder.
This is getting quite serious.
And madness. In the movie that makes a scene of the crime.
So hold it!
Clue. It's not just a game anymore.
So I'm curious, do you remember ever first hearing about this movie?
Yes. I mean, I'm gonna be honest. I have never played the board game.
What?
Which is crazy. I was sent a version of it with the Alienist. They kind of did a board game that was basically Clue, but with their own characters. And that's the only one that I've ever had or played, which is just crazy to me because I love that kind of stuff. And so I just always thought, well, I feel like I should either play the game first before I watch this movie. And so I always kept, putting it off. But yeah.
Oh, and then along came Sam Neill, and it was like, nope, can't wait any longer. It's now or never, Kubincanek.
For real.
I love that. So I apologize for tarnishing that potential connection.
Well, I don't even know what came first, the board game or the movie.
The board game came well before the movie.
Okay.
I looked up earlier. It's weird. I did not know this until literally an hour ago. The game actually was invented in 1949 and was originally called Cluedo. Cluedo. I don't know what that's about. I guess it's just an interesting spin on the word clue, and they eventually just decided, F it, we'll do Clue instead. So that happened early on in the process. But yeah, it's been around forever. And I will say this right now, I haven't seen them all, but I'm willing to bet best movie based off of a board game. Battleship came close.
Yeah, I don't watch very many, but I think that was why I had put this one off for so long, because I was like, I just can't imagine what that's going to be like. But it definitely was very good in that respect.
It's fascinating because I remember not hearing about this movie first. My first memory is being amazed that it existed. I played this game all the time as a kid. It was always perfectly suited to the way my mind works and the way it's kind of constantly analyzing things and thinking about a bunch of different things at once. And my eyes sort of dart around the room a lot. That's kind of my personality. And so it's always been right up my alley. And I remember thinking, there's a Clue movie? That's probably really boring. And as it turns out, the adaptation from game to movie is more spiritual than anything. They kind of took the most basic elements of it and just transferred it into a little bit more of a conventional murder mystery that a lot of which had been kind of coming about in the 1970s and before. And yeah, it was written by the director Jonathan Lynn, who this is actually his debut feature. He would go on to do such comedies as My Cousin Vinny and Sergeant Bilko, among others. So a very comedically inclined director. It was co-written. I did not know this until I saw the credits earlier today. It was co-written by John Landis, director of a lot of comedies from that era, some of which still hold up to this day. A lot of them do not. I'm looking at you, Animal House and Kentucky Fried Movie. Those have not aged particularly well, but Blues Brothers is great. Did an extra milestone about that one earlier this year with my friend Tyler. Little shameless plug for that one. And yeah, it's very much that sort of zany, a little random sense of humor, but not in the same way as something like Airplane, I would say, which had just come out earlier, where that is almost like unprecedented levels of randomness, where it doesn't even matter if there's a joke there. They're going to make it. You know what I'm saying? The sense of humor in this movie is all very environmental. It's all centered around the characters and the environment and the situation. They don't deviate a lot from it, but they manage to find a lot of really hilarious stuff in this movie. So it is at this point, I really should have asked this earlier, but what did you think of Clue, having just seen it for the first time in the past couple of days?
I really enjoyed it. I wasn't expecting to be surprised as I was, because I thought back at the Christie. I really am a huge like murder mystery fan. And so I thought, I'm definitely going to be able to tell who did this, and like where this is going to go. And I really had no idea. So it was really great to experience that, and love Madeline Kahn more than anyone.
Yes.
So I just really loved getting to see a performance that I haven't seen before.
Every actor is so perfectly tailored to their performance in this movie that it's kind of remarkable. I wish I'd seen this years ago, because you got to imagine this is another one where it's any actor's dream to be cast in this movie.
I only know Michael McKean from Better Call Saul, so seeing him in this role is just very interesting and very cool.
Yeah, a lot of some of the actors in this movie you are more recognizable than others. Among them, you've got Eileen Brennan, Madeline Kahn, of course, the great Madeline Kahn, I should say, from Young Frankenstein and many other things. And also, same year as Back to the Future, Christopher Lloyd. And it becomes all the more clear how much they had to age up Christopher Lloyd for Back to the Future.
I did not realize that until watching this movie. It's crazy.
It's so funny. I thought for the longest time that Christopher Lloyd was just one of those actors who's looked 55 years old since the 80s. But it turns out, no, that was just impeccable makeup work that was done on Back to the Future. It's not like Charles Bronson, who's been 50 years old since birth. It's like, that was some remarkable work. I think my favorite example of that, and this is a tangent, but we're here, so why not? My favorite example of that is Max von Sydow in The Exorcist. I don't know who designed the makeup for that movie, but they predicted so eerily accurately how Max von Sydow would look like almost 50 years later that it's kind of freaky, you know? So that's always been the kind of the single best instance of aging someone up. But yeah, got Christopher Lloyd in this movie. You got Leslie Ann Warren, Michael McKean, who you mentioned earlier, Martin Mull, and the great Tim Curry, who plays Wadsworth, the butler. I love Tim Curry so much in this movie. I think especially at the end, like he'd been a fun character up until that point, but it's not until he starts saying like, all right, I know what happened, but to do so, I'm going to have to explain everything. And not only that, but run around to the locations where that happens. It is a divine work of comedic acting of the kind that I don't even think I would have been sure that Tim Curry was capable of before seeing this movie.
Yeah, I mean, when murder mysteries kind of get into that, let me explain, kind of part of the plot, it's so easy for it to get boring, but definitely not in this movie, which is great.
I was reminded of in Murder on the Orient Express, the Sidney Lumet version. Have you ever seen that one?
I haven't, actually.
They have that sequence where it's Albert Finney as Detective Poirot, who just says like, all right, well, I'm going to explain everything that happened. And he does it in a very stead fashion. Like it fits with the tone of what was going so far. But it's one of those things where I hadn't thought about this until right this second, but could this be considered like almost a parody or a satire even of murder mysteries? Do you think?
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, absolutely. Because I think, I mean, so many of the characters are kind of parodies of tropes within, especially Agatha Christie stories. Mm-hmm. The maid is French, and what they try to make into a bimbo kind of, and like, I think there's a Black Widow woman and the butler, and so I definitely see that being considered that way.
It's weird. It seems obvious now that it occurred to me. I guess it's just I hadn't thought of it in those terms. I also just finished the movie like an hour and a half ago, so maybe that explains it. But yeah, I guess I was just sort of going on the notion that this is just a murder mystery that's a little bit heightened. And then I realized all too late, this is a lot a bit heightened. Like it's really, really remarkably hilarious. And yeah, basically the deal with the movie is that these six strangers show up. They've all received a mysterious letter saying, come to this address. It's this big mansion and it's a dark and stormy night, because of course it is. And they're all the characters from the games, the little avatars that you play as. In the board game, they're just, these little colored talismans that you move around the board and everything. They don't really have distinct personalities. In this movie, every single one of them makes a remarkably distinct impression. I love that Miss White is dressed all in black. Like that's always one of my favorite things. Like they could have so easily color coded these characters and they didn't. And I really respect that. And they all show up and none of them know why, except for Tim Curry, of course, who's just this very eccentric butler who just seems to have everything in place and seems to know where to be at every second. And they realize like, well, we don't know who our host is or who invited us here and everything. And then some murders get murdered along the way, a lot of them over the course of the movie, and it just keeps escalating, keep going. They eventually like pair off into groups. They eventually get a hold of all the weapons also from the game. I found out a fun fact that the mansion that they use in this movie, which is mostly a soundstage that they filmed around, but it is, the architecture of it is designed in such a way that it's accurate to the board game, to the layout of the board game, complete with the secret passages. Like they go to the same to and from the same room. So that's really, really impressive.
Yeah.
That attention to detail. I found out in doing a little bit of research for this movie that Tim Curry was actually like the third choice to play Wadsworth the butler. I think it was Rowan Atkinson, which would have been fun. Someone else whose name I don't remember. And then Tim Curry was the one that they went with because they couldn't get the others. And I wonder at what point did they realize like, oh, we really lucked out with this one. So I think things worked out okay, And how envious those other actors who passed on the role or couldn't do it, how regretful they probably were.
Yeah, I'm sure.
It's kind of like the whole thing where Billy Crystal was originally going to voice Buzz Lightyear in Toy Story and said like, no one's going to see that movie. And it ended up being just this huge hit and was like, oh, okay, so I got to take the next role they offer me. Mike Wazowski, got it. I'll take it.
I love that role though, too.
Mike Wazowski is great. I can't imagine anyone else as Mike. So I think some things just work out in the end, you know. It gets me to wondering, like, what things did we not luck out on? You know, like, was there an even better actor who could have played, like, I don't know, oh gosh, why am I blanking on literally everything? Is there a better actor who could have played like Professor Plum in this movie that we just never realized? So who knows? Who knows?
Maybe.
But yeah, and actually another funny bit of almost casting was that Carrie Fisher was originally going to play Miss Scarlet, the character ultimately played by Leslie Ann Warren, who I think really, really shines in the role. I wonder how Carrie Fisher would have done, but at the time she was just entering rehab, so she could not do it. So I hope everything worked out for her. So from what I can tell, it did, at least at the time. But yeah, so I want to ask, what are some things that, besides just how funny and zany it is, because of course, what are some other things that really stuck out to you about Clue that you were impressed by?
I think the construction of reveal of kind of the murder plot and how that kind of plays out is amazing. Which, I mean, you probably expect from the game of it, but it also, like you said, I'm surprised that the game doesn't have these kind of characters, because they feel very like intrinsic to the theme of it and like the plot. So I love that, and I think it does such a great job of making it seem like it really could be anyone. I really, as through watching it, I was like, I know these people, but I really don't know these people. And that's so great in a murder mystery. So I loved that.
It's always such a really impressive feat of acting when reveals like this are made in whatever genre, whether it's comedy, drama, whatever it is. And I would be so fascinated to go back and rewatch this movie now, knowing some of the reveals, not only like, you know, who did it, of course, which is kind of the biggest question of them all, but sort of these little individual aspects of their characters that get revealed over time. We find out very early that all 6 of these characters are, in one way or another, being blackmailed by their host, Mr. Body, who's just has a very on the nose name.
Yes.
I would be really curious to see this again, seeing like, okay, so how do I look at this performance differently now that I know more of their past that they haven't revealed to the other characters, but that I know. I think something else really notable about what you were talking about earlier, how it's impossible to get a line on who maybe could have done it, is that not only does the movie play very coy with it and sort of never really give any hints or indications that it may have been any one person over the other, but there is no, to use the long-standing narrative term, there is no straight person. There's no one who's meant to sort of counteract the zany antics of everyone else. They're all, and what's most impressive about that is that they're all different kinds of heightened. Like none of them are just sort of the straight person, like the Adam West Batman, so to speak. That's kind of the function that I feel like that version of the character played. None of them are that, but also none of them are the same kind of crazy. They all have a different sort of way of carrying themselves, sort of a different attitude, a different temperament that makes it come across in such a way that, again, like you were saying, you sort of know them and don't know them in such a way that you have no idea if they're acting out of character or not, because it's all so unusual,
Yeah.
One thing I love is that, and this is kind of a random small detail, but early in the movie, as they're all sort of arriving at the mansion, Miss Scarlet's car has broken down, and like she's got the hood open and stuff, trying to figure out what's wrong with it. She sees Professor Plum driving up, and he offers her a ride and everything. And then she leaves her headlights on, which is just me having made that mistake several times. I'm like, well, there's your problem. It's gonna drain the battery there, Miss Scarlet. But that's just a small thing. So if you notice that, don't worry. I noticed it too.
I did not. But...
Fair enough. Yeah. What are some other things that really stuck out to you, having only just seen it the first time?
I think there's a great balance of physical comedy and very witty comedy within the dialogue, which I always appreciate a good balance of those two. I noticed that.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's especially, I think the physical comedy sort of really takes the stage later in the movie, but it's there all throughout, and there's a lot of just really they're just really putting their all into this movie. All these actors, they're like really exaggerating everything to make it as funny as possible, but they're also not giving short shrift to the actual dialogue itself. And it's a good thing they did, because I think this movie has a damn good ratio when it comes to like joke success. You know what I'm saying? Like the only thing that I kind of had a few reservations about were that there were a few sort of, I'll just say, aspects of the humor that came across as like maybe a little prurient, maybe a little adolescent, little mean-spirited. But also I feel like that's probably just us looking back and feeling that way now. I'm sure in the 80s this was, perfectly normal and stuff. Did that kind of thing occur to you at all while you were watching this?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely jokes that would not, and even like characteristics of characters that I don't think would pass today.
Yeah.
But that's how it is, I think.
Yeah, I think it still plays perfectly fine. It's just they're there, so it's nothing super egregious or anything. But yeah, I think I do feel the need to sort of discuss the ending a little bit. So we're gonna like do a little warning and stuff. But before we do that, is there anything else aside from the ending that we haven't mentioned yet that you wanted to bring up?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I think it's a well-made movie. It's a very well-produced and acted movie. It's not a terribly complex one, so I think we pretty much covered it. So yes. The ending of this movie is very iconic, and actually I knew about the ending before ever seeing it. Had you heard about the way the ending is structured before seeing it?
No, I truly knew nothing about the plot or anything, which is remarkable.
Nice. So I'm glad that we got to sort of discover it together. And so I got to know, what was your reaction? Just full of misspeaking words today. What was your reaction to kind of the bizarre fourth wall breaking, unorthodox ending to this? And did you laugh as hard as I did when it was happening?
I loved it. And I think that if it would have just been a one simple ending, it wouldn't have really served the board game as well as this one did. And I think the ultimate ending was definitely the most interesting version, and so I think they structured it pretty well in that regard too.
Yeah, I, even having known about like kind of the way it plays out, I was still just like howling laughing as kind of throughout the entire climax, but especially when it's revealed like there's this dramatic conclusion. We find out that it was Miss Scarlet all along, and then all of a sudden that's one thing that could have happened. But also, this plays a completely different ending. And then it does, where I think it was Miss Peacock did it that second time. And it says, but here's what really happened. And it turns out that it was actually kind of everyone at once. Yeah. Which is similar to another murder mystery, but it would be a spoiler to say which one. So I won't tell you, but there's another, a more sincere murder mystery that has that same ending, or that same kind of ending. But yeah, if you've seen it, you know, and I'm not ruining anything.
You're going to have to tell me after this episode, because I'm blinking I want to know.
I will tell you after this episode.
Okay.
I found out there was actually a fourth ending that they filmed and ended up cutting from the movie just because they thought it didn't really fit in. And it's where it turns out it was Wadsworth all along, as in, like, literally was responsible for every single one of the deaths, and tries to like speed off in a cop car, and then ultimately gets attacked by police dogs who are hiding in the backseat unbeknownst to him. Sounds like a fun ending. I'm sure that scene exists somewhere, like on some home video release or something. I watched this on Amazon Prime, so I don't think they had anything like that. But yeah, I think the way it plays is really wonderful. And I actually forgot to mention this earlier, but one or both of the writers, I can't remember exactly who, have this really bizarre claim that they made. And I wish I would have looked more into the authenticity of this, but they claimed that they sort of got together and wrote this movie with a sort of writer's room consisting of playwright Tom Stoppard, Stephen Sondheim, and Anthony Perkins. What the hell? How I would love to be on a fly on the wall in that room as they're constructing this madcap thing, because as we know, Anthony Perkins wouldn't even hurt a fly, so we'd be safe. Little Psycho reference for you Hitchcock fans out there, but yeah, it's perfectly in line with the game, where it's just this, it's just sort of this random outcome every single time. You've heard references to it where it's like, oh, it's so-and-so in the observatory with the rope and stuff like that. So it's always something different. And so I love that it plays into that, incorporating the game just enough that it's clearly an adaptation. Like, it's definitely taking cues from the intricacies of the board game, but also just telling its own story and fleshing it out in just such a way that I found really impressive. And I was actually surprised to find out that this got a rather mixed reaction at the time when it was first released. I'm curious why that was. I'm wondering if it was maybe just too weird for them, if they just hadn't seen anything like it, or if they just weren't in the mood for it at the time, and it's only now when we're able to sort of realize how well done it is in comparison to other similar movies. Do you have any theory on that?
I don't really know. I'm trying to think of the kinds of comedies that were coming out at the same time. And blanking, obviously.
Yeah, there was like the Blues Brothers, which I mentioned earlier, and Airplane and stuff. A lot of those other John Landis movies. There was also Monty Python was still very famous at the time. So I think it's certainly in line with those, at least. Like, it's not a distinct departure from any of those. So I couldn't say, really. It's a strange thing. Both Siskel and Ebert were initially disapproving of this movie. So who knows? But yeah, it has gained a very respectable cult audience, and I'm glad to have finally discovered why.
Me too.
Yeah. So is there anything else that you wanted to discuss about the movie Clue before we close out the show for this week?
No, I think we've covered everything that I have to say.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I think, again, this is not the most complex movie, but I think one certainly worthy of revisiting and worthy of celebrating the anniversary of. And I will say, all three of these movies are worthy of the Extra Milestone treatment. And I was glad to have given that to them. That's a weird sentence to have put together just now. I was glad to have done it with you, Emily Kubincanek. And I hope you had as good of a time as I did.
I did.
Awesome. So for listeners who maybe don't know, and they should, if they want to know, where else can they find you on this web that is worldwide of ours?
I'm always on Twitter, Emily KUB _ where anything I write will be put on there. And you can find all of my articles at Film School Rejects, especially if you like older movies. I have a column called Beyond the Classics, which I cover movies that probably wouldn't be on Extra Milestone, but are still important to me.
Challenge accepted. Go on.
Okay. And yeah.
Nice. Yeah, definitely do that. It's you're gonna want to follow everything that Emily does because it's all fantastic. I'm also. I say it because it's true. I'm also on Twitter at Nolan Sam. I barely do anything on there. Like it's almost pointless to follow me on Twitter. So what you can do instead, if you want to see me do all these various impressions that I've done, all these silly voices and everything, you can follow me on the social media app known as TikTok. I'm on there making silly videos.
I didn't know that.
It's a fun time. So that's the exact same handle at Nolan Sam. That's where I do most of my work. So yeah. And also I'm on Letterboxd, just my name, Sam Nolan, and I'm always here on this show, Extra Milestone, never more than a week away. Wrap it up, take it down to the corner, and just take that to the bank. I don't know where I was going with that sentence, but I think I got there. So without any further ado, from a dark and stormy night on a battleship with my friend Harvey, I'm Sam Nolan.
I'm Emily Kubincanek.
And we'll see you on the next Extra Milestone.